The British government just collapsed. Minutes ago, the Supreme Court delivered a ruling so explosive it sent shockwaves through Westminster. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister who promised stability and change, now faces an order that could end his career. The highest court in the land has spoken, and what they've said has thrown Britain into absolute chaos. Parliament is in emergency session. Ministers are resigning. The opposition is calling for immediate elections, and the British people, they're watching their democracy unravel in real time. This isn't a political scandal. This isn't a policy disagreement. This is a constitutional crisis of historic proportions. And what happens in the next 48 hours will determine the future of the United Kingdom itself. The Supreme Court chamber was silent as Lady Chief Justice Victoria Rothwell prepared to deliver the judgment. Outside, protesters had already begun to gather, somehow sensing that something monumental was about to happen. Inside number 10 Downing Street, Keir Starmer was in a routine meeting with his cabinet when his private secretary rushed in with a message that made the Prime Minister's face go pale. The ruling had come down early without warning, and it was devastating. The case itself had been building for months, a constitutional challenge that legal experts had been watching closely, but that most of the public had barely noticed. It centred on executive powers, parliamentary sovereignty, and the fundamental question of who actually governs Britain. The specifics were complex, involving emergency powers that Starmer had invoked during an economic crisis, measures that bypassed normal parliamentary procedures in ways that constitutional scholars found deeply troubling. The Supreme Court's ruling was unequivocal and brutal. By a majority of 8-3, the justices had determined that the Prime Minister had acted beyond his constitutional authority, violating the fundamental principles of parliamentary democracy that have governed Britain for centuries. But the ruling didn't stop there. In an unprecedented move, the court had gone further than anyone expected. They didn't just declare the actions unlawful. They didn't just strike down the emergency measures. They ruled that the Prime Minister's position itself had become constitutionally untenable, that he could not continue to hold office while having so fundamentally breached the democratic principles he was sworn to uphold. The word resign appeared 17 times in the 100-page judgment. It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a recommendation. The Supreme Court, in language that left no room for interpretation, had effectively ordered the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to step down. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within minutes, the judgment was trending worldwide. British media outlets scrambled to understand the full implications of what had just happened. Constitutional experts were being pulled into emergency broadcasts, all of them saying the same thing. This had never happened before in modern British history. The Supreme Court had never directly ordered a sitting Prime Minister to resign. The separation of powers, the delicate balance between judiciary and executive, had always prevented such a direct confrontation. Until now, the ruling had shattered that precedent, and in doing so, it had opened up questions that nobody knew how to answer. What happens if the Prime Minister refuses to resign? Does the court have the power to enforce its ruling? Can Parliament step in? Should the King intervene? Every answer led to more questions, and every question revealed just how unprecedented this crisis truly was. Inside Downing Street, chaos reigned. Starmer's senior advisors were divided. Some were urging him to resign immediately, to respect the court's authority and preserve what remained of his dignity and legacy. Others were counselling defiance, arguing that the Supreme Court had overstepped its bounds, that this was a judicial coup that would set a dangerous precedent for executive authority. The Attorney General was frantically reviewing the judgment, looking for any legal avenue, any procedural flaw that could be challenged. But the ruling was solid, meticulously reasoned and backed by centuries of constitutional principle. The Prime Minister had a decision to make, and whatever he chose would reshape British politics for generations. If he resigned, he would be admitting guilt, accepting that his actions had been so egregious that they warranted this extraordinary judicial intervention. His government would collapse, his party would be thrown into turmoil, and his legacy would be defined by this moment of constitutional failure. But if he refused to resign, the consequences could be even more catastrophic. He would be defying the Supreme Court, placing himself above the law in a way that would fundamentally undermine the rule of law itself. Parliament would be forced to act, likely through a vote of no confidence that would expose the deep divisions within his own party. The opposition would have a field day painting him as a dictator who refused to respect democratic institutions. And the British people would watch as their democracy descended into a constitutional deadlock that nobody knew how to resolve. The clock was ticking, and every minute of silence from Downing Street made the situation more volatile. Outside Westminster, the protests were growing. Supporters of the Prime Minister were gathering on one side, chanting about judicial overreach and defending their elected leader. On the other side, those demanding his immediate resignation were waving flags and holding signs declaring that no one was above the law. The police presence was massive, riot gear visible as tensions between the two groups escalated. This wasn't just a political protest anymore. This was a nation divided, with fundamental questions about democracy, justice and power playing out on the streets of London. Social media was ablaze with conspiracy theories and accusations flying in every direction. Some claimed this was a coordinated attack by establishment forces threatened by Starmer's reforms. Others insisted this was justice finally being served against a prime minister who had become too powerful, too willing to circumvent democratic processes for political convenience. The opposition parties sensed blood in the water and moved with remarkable speed. Within hours of the ruling, the leader of the opposition had called for an emergency debate in Parliament, demanding that the Prime Minister appear before the House of Commons to explain his actions and announce his resignation. Smaller parties joined the chorus, with some going even further, calling for immediate general elections to allow the British people to decide who should govern in the wake of this crisis. But there was a problem with that plan. Even if Starmer did resign, the process of replacing him would take time. His party would need to elect a new leader, and that process could take weeks or even months. During that time, Britain would effectively be without a functioning government, adrift in political uncertainty while facing economic challenges and international obligations that couldn't simply be put on hold. The international reaction was swift and concerned. Allies watched nervously as Britain, a cornerstone of Western democracy and a key player in global affairs, descended into internal chaos. Financial markets reacted with alarm, the pound falling sharply as investors worried about political instability in one of the world's major economies. Trading partners began questioning whether Britain could be relied upon to honour agreements and maintain policy continuity. Some foreign leaders offered carefully worded statements of support for British democratic institutions, diplomatic language that barely concealed their shock at what was unfolding. This wasn't supposed to happen in Britain. This was the mother of parliaments, the nation that had exported its democratic model around the world. And now that model was being tested in ways that nobody had anticipated, revealing cracks in the constitutional foundation that had seemed unshakable. The emergency session of Parliament convened at 7 in the evening. The chamber packed with members from all parties as the Speaker called for order. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation as everyone waited to see if the Prime Minister would actually appear or if his empty chair would become the defining image of this constitutional crisis. When Keir Starmer finally walked through the doors, the chamber erupted into a cacophony of jeers and cheers that the Speaker struggled to control. His face was drawn and pale, the weight of the day's events visible in every step he took toward the dispatch box. This was the moment that would define not just his premiership, but potentially the entire future of British governance. The opposition benches were baying for blood, waving their order papers and demanding answers, while his own backbenchers sat in stunned silence, uncertain whether to support their leader or distance themselves from what increasingly looked like a sinking ship. Starmer's statement was defiant and combative in ways that shocked even his closest allies. He began by acknowledging the Supreme Court's ruling, but immediately pivoted to challenging its legitimacy and scope. He argued that the court had exceeded its constitutional mandate, that it had ventured into political territory that properly belonged to Parliament and the electorate. The emergency powers he had invoked were necessary to address an unprecedented economic crisis that threatened the livelihoods of millions of British citizens. Every decision he made was in consultation with legal advisers and was intended to protect the national interest when normal parliamentary procedures were simply too slow to address rapidly evolving circumstances. He accused the court of judicial activism, of allowing political considerations to influence what should have been a purely legal judgment. And then he said the words that would dominate headlines for days to come. He would not resign. He would not accept that the Supreme Court had the authority to remove a democratically elected Prime Minister from office. That power, he insisted, belonged to Parliament alone, through the established mechanisms of votes of confidence and general elections. The reaction was explosive and immediate. Opposition members leaped to their feet, shouting accusations of dictatorship and constitutional vandalism. Several of his own party members sat with their heads in their hands, realising that their leader had just escalated the crisis to levels nobody thought possible. The leader of the opposition delivered a withering response, accusing Starmer of placing himself above the law and betraying every principle of British democracy. He announced that his party would table a motion of no confidence to be voted on within 48 hours, and he called on all members who believed in the rule of law to support it, regardless of party loyalty. Smaller parties lined up to condemn the Prime Minister's defiance, with some using language rarely heard in parliamentary debate, calling his statement a declaration of war against the Constitution itself. The debate raged for hours, with speaker after speaker rising to either condemn or defend the Prime Minister's position, the arguments becoming more heated and personal as the night wore on. Behind the scenes, the political manoeuvring was frantic and ruthless. Cabinet members were being pulled aside by whips and party operatives, pressured to declare their loyalty or face the consequences. Several junior ministers had already resigned in protest at the Prime Minister's refusal to accept the court's ruling, their resignation letters scathing in their criticism of his judgment and leadership. Senior cabinet members were trapped in an impossible position, knowing that supporting Starmer could end their own political careers, but also aware that abandoning him might trigger a leadership crisis that could destroy the party for a generation. Phone calls were being made to party donors and influential backbenchers. Deals were being offered and threatened as both sides tried to secure the numbers they would need for the upcoming confidence vote. The parliamentary arithmetic was brutal and uncertain. The government's majority was slim, and it would take only a handful of rebels voting with the opposition to bring down the Prime Minister. The legal community was in uproar over Starmer's defiance of the Supreme Court ruling. Senior barristers and legal scholars issued a joint statement warning that his refusal to resign posed an existential threat to the rule of law in Britain. They argued that if a Prime Minister could simply ignore a Supreme Court ruling he disagreed with, then the entire basis of constitutional democracy was undermined. What would stop future leaders from dismissing court rulings that were politically inconvenient? The statement was signed by hundreds of legal professionals, including several who had previously served in government and some who were known supporters of Starmer's party. The Law Society and Bar Council both issued their own statements expressing grave concern about the constitutional implications of the standoff. Even retired Supreme Court justices, who normally maintain strict silence on political matters, were speaking out about the unprecedented nature of the crisis and the danger of allowing any branch of government to defy the others without consequence. The protest movements that had begun outside Westminster were now spreading across the country. In major cities from Manchester to Edinburgh, from Birmingham to Cardiff, thousands of people were taking to the streets to make their voices heard. The demonstrations were largely split along partisan lines, with pro-Starmer crowds arguing that the Supreme Court had staged a coup against democracy itself, while anti-Starmer protesters insisted that no one was above the law and that his refusal to resign proved he was unfit for office. The protests remained mostly peaceful, but there were scattered reports of clashes between opposing groups and confrontations with police. Social media amplified every incident, with both sides sharing videos and images designed to paint the other as violent extremists. The polarisation was deepening by the hour, with nuance and compromise becoming impossible as people retreated into their respective camps. Britain was fracturing along lines that went beyond traditional party politics. touching on fundamental questions about authority, legitimacy, and the very nature of democratic governance. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The morning after the parliamentary showdown brought no relief from the mounting crisis as newspapers across Britain splashed dramatic headlines that captured the gravity of the situation. The political establishment woke to a nation more divided than at any point since the Brexit referendum, with polling data showing the public almost evenly split on whether Starmer should resign or stand firm against what his supporters were calling judicial overreach. Financial markets opened with the pound continuing its sharp decline against major currencies as investors fled from British assets amid the uncertainty. The Bank of England issued an emergency statement attempting to calm fears about economic stability, but the markets were unconvinced, with traders openly questioning how Britain could function as a reliable economic partner when its government was locked in existential combat with its highest court. International credit rating agencies warned they were reviewing Britain's sovereign debt rating, a move that could have devastating implications for government borrowing costs and the wider economy. The confidence vote, scheduled for the following day, was dominating every conversation in Westminster as whips from all parties worked frantically to secure commitments from wavering members. The mathematics were brutal and everyone knew it. The government's working majority was just 12 seats, meaning that if 7 members of the ruling party voted against Starmer or even just abstained, the government would fall. Intelligence from the whip's office suggested that at least 15 backbenchers were seriously considering rebelling, with perhaps double that number still undecided and vulnerable to pressure from either side. The rebels were largely from 2 camps. Some were veteran parliamentarians who genuinely believed that respecting the Supreme Court's authority was more important than party loyalty, viewing this as a matter of constitutional principle that transcended normal political considerations. Others were younger, ambitious members who saw an opportunity to position themselves for advancement in whatever new leadership emerged from the chaos, calculating that being on the right side of history was worth the risk of defying the current Prime Minister. Cabinet meetings had become tense exercises in survival politics as senior ministers tried to navigate the impossible situation they found themselves in. The Home Secretary and Chancellor remained publicly loyal to Starmer, but sources close to both suggested they were privately urging him to find some kind of compromise that would allow him to step back without completely capitulating to the court's demands. The Foreign Secretary had been conspicuously silent since the ruling was announced, fueling speculation that she was positioning herself for a potential leadership bid if Starmer fell. Several cabinet members were reportedly in talks with senior backbenchers about possible exit strategies that would allow the party to move beyond Starmer, while avoiding the chaos of a general election that polls suggested they would lose badly. The discussions were delicate and dangerous because any hint of disloyalty could trigger an immediate reshuffle that would end careers. But staying silent and watching the government collapse was equally risky for ministers with their own ambitions. Legal experts were now focusing on the unprecedented question of what actually happens when a Prime Minister defies a Supreme Court order to resign. Britain's unwritten constitution provided no clear mechanism for resolving such a standoff because the framers of the constitutional settlement had never imagined it would be necessary. Some constitutional scholars argued that the King would be obligated to intervene, potentially dismissing Starmer and inviting the opposition to form a government. But others insisted that such royal involvement would itself trigger a constitutional crisis by dragging the monarchy into partisan political disputes. There were arcane legal arguments about whether Parliament could pass emergency legislation to force compliance with the court's ruling. But such legislation would require time to draft and debate and might itself be challenged in the courts. The circular nature of the constitutional impasse was becoming increasingly apparent with each passing hour. Every solution seemed to create new problems, every answer raised fresh questions, and the lack of any clear precedent meant that Britain was effectively making up constitutional law in real time under the most extreme political pressure imaginable. The international dimension of the crisis was becoming increasingly problematic as Britain's allies struggled to respond appropriately to what was unfolding. the United States issued a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in British democratic institutions while pointedly declining to express support for Starmer personally. Diplomatic language that everyone understood as a rebuke. European Union officials privately expressed schadenfreude at Britain's troubles given the acrimonious Brexit negotiations, though publicly they maintained that they hoped for a swift resolution to the uncertainty. Commonwealth nations watched with particular concern given that many had inherited constitutional systems based on the Westminster model, and the precedent being set in London could have implications for how those systems functioned. NATO allies were worried about the military and security implications of having a key member state consumed by internal political warfare at a time when international tensions required coordinated responses. Defence officials from allied nations were quietly reaching out to their British counterparts, seeking assurances that command and control systems would remain functional regardless of what happened politically. The media coverage had reached fever pitch, with broadcasters providing round-the-clock analysis and speculation about every development, no matter how minor. Every statement from any politician was passed for hidden meanings and analysed by panels of experts offering conflicting interpretations. Social media had become a battleground where armies of supporters from both sides shared carefully edited clips and misleading headlines designed to support their preferred narratives. Conspiracy theories were flourishing in the information chaos, with some claiming that foreign powers had orchestrated the entire crisis to destabilise Britain, while others insisted that shadowy domestic elites were manipulating the courts to remove a prime minister who threatened their interests.